Okay, are we ready for the last chapter? Land ho, here we go. Page 111, chapter 12. When we got back to room 26, I was almost too tired to squeak, but I managed to tell Og I'd had a great adventure, nearly drowned, and lived to tell the tale. Boing! At least he sounded interested. I didn't get to tell him more because the bell rang for the recess and my classmates streamed out of the room. The room wasn't empty for long, though, because Mrs. Wright, Mr. Morales, and Miss Mack all joined Mrs. Brisbane in the classroom. Do you have a minute, Sue? The principal asked. He was still wearing his red shirt with the bright blue sash. He'd taken off his earrings and eye patch, though. Of course, she said. Please sit down. It's always funny to see grown-ups sitting in the kid-sized chairs in the classroom. I tried to imagine them as students. Mr. Morales would be a good student with playful streak. Mrs. Brisbane would be an excellent student like Saya. Of course, Miss Mack would be an almost perfect human like Miranda. But try as I did, I couldn't imagine Mrs. Wright as a child. Did any of the students admit to smuggling Humphrey onto the boat? Mr. Morales asked. Mrs. Brisbane shook her head. No, I think Kirk and Richie felt so terrible that they would have confessed to it, but they didn't. Maybe someone was jealous of their boat and did it to get them in trouble, Mrs. Wright suggested. Maybe, said Mrs. Brisbane. But I just can't imagine any of the students doing that. Mrs. Wright sniffed loudly. I know you think all your students are perfect, she said, but someone had to do it. He certainly couldn't have gotten there all by himself. Suddenly, everyone turned and looked at me. I didn't plan on going along, I squeaked in self-defense. It just happened. Miss Mack laughed her lovely, tinkling laugh. He's been known to get out of his cage before, Mrs. Brisbane said, but Bert fixed the door so he couldn't get out. Mrs. Wright stood up and clomped over to the cage. Even if he could open the cage, you can't tell me that this little rat or guinea pig or whatever he is could possibly get down from the table, run all across the room, and get in the boat by himself. Impossible. Simply impossible. I'm a hamster, I squeaked back at her, and it is not impossible. Boing, 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 Og chimed in. This time, everyone laughed, except Mrs. Wright. I guess Mr. Morales was sorry he'd laughed. You have a point, Ruth. Mrs. Wright sniffed again. Maybe she was allergic to hamsters. We can't have animals running willy-nilly around the school, like on the buses and on picnics. It was the only one animal, Mrs. Brisbane said softly. The bell rang again. Mr. Morales stood up. Look, Mrs. Brisbane has been handling her students and their problems for 30 years. I think she can handle this one. Let's move on. He left along with Miss Mack and Mrs. Wright just before my friends returned from recess. Mrs. Brisbane came over to my cage and jiggled the door. It was fastened tightly, of course. Humphrey, I must say, life is never dull with you around. Thanks, I squeaked. That's what a classroom hamster's for. After school, when we were alone, I told Og the whole story. When I finished, I remembered something else. I'd have to say, Og, that as I was about to sink, I thought of you. It was strange to remember seeing his goofy face flash before me. I know you'd been there. I know if you'd been there, you would have saved me because you can swim and because you're my friend. Oops. I was surprised at how quickly Og responded with a boing, 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 boing. I'd do the same for you, I continued. I can't swim, but I'd think of something. I guess we make a pretty good team after all. Maybe Kirk and Richie will too. Og dived into the water with an impressive splash. And with that, I crawled into my sleeping hut and slept soundly, dreaming about the high seas, pirates, best friends, and yes, Miss Mac. No more boat building, no more pirate talk, no more contest. The very next day, we were back to regular old school again. But after my close call with Davy Jones' locker, I didn't mind. Not that the subject of the boat race didn't come up. Mrs. Brisbane began the day with a very serious look on her face. Boys and girls, we still don't know who sneaked Humphrey onto the boat and onto the bus. If the guilty party would like to confess now, it would make all of our lives easier. There were some shuffling feet and a few cleared throats, but no one confessed. There was no one to confess, except for me. I hate to punish the whole class, Miss Brisbane continued. I couldn't take it any longer. I did it! It was me! Me! I squeaked as loudly as I could. Everyone laughed, even Miss Brisbane. I guess Humphrey has the last word for now, she said. If anyone would like to confess to me in private, I'd appreciate it. Meanwhile, we're moving on. Over the next few days, there were a few changes in room 26. First of all, Richie and Kirk had to write letters of apology to each other. Then each of them had to give a speech to the class apologizing for almost ruining the boat race. In the speech, Kirk said that teamwork was more important than winning, and that a team that works together always comes out ahead in the end. As usual, he ended it with a joke. This time, it was one I'd already heard, about the Scarecrow winning the award for being outstanding in the field. Richie made a point that 2 wrongs don't make a right. The first, I thought he was talking about Mrs. Wright, and I shivered a little because just thinking about her whistle, though she was a very good song leader. But then I realized that he meant just because Kirk treated Richie the wrong way didn't make it right for Richie to break the rules and bring along a submarine. I cheered loudly for both speeches, although changed back into his regular non-private ways of talking and cleaning. Thank goodness. But every once in a while, he'd do a little hornpipe dance while he was dusting. The other change in room 26 was something, or someone, wonderful. Miss Mac came in to help Mrs. Brisbane for 2 hours every day. Then she would go to the library and help Mr. Fitch for another hour or 2. She smelled so good, and she always remembered to bring me yummy treats like apple slices and strawberries. Having her around was a dream come true. One day, she asked Mrs. Brisbane if she could have lunch with her. She sat across from each other and Mrs. Brisbane's desk and took out sandwiches and water and yummy-looking fruit, and they talked. I'm so glad it worked out with Humphrey, Mrs. Mac said. When I left here, I wasn't sure you'd like having a classroom hamster. Well, I wasn't sure myself, Miss Brisbane admitted, but he added a lot to the class. Good, said Mrs. Mac. She chewed on her sandwich a little more and then said, I'm a little worried about what I'm going to do now that I'm back. I need to make some money. Funny. I've been worrying about that too, Mrs. Brisbane replied. She didn't look worried, though. In fact, she was grinning. I have some ideas. Miss Mac's brown eyes got bigger. What? I don't want to say yet, but you're a very talented young teacher, and I know several opportunities coming up. Mrs. Brisbane was being awfully mysterious. You'll find out soon. What? I shouted. The 2 women chuckled. It sounded like Humphrey has a few ideas too, Miss Mac said. He always does, Miss Brisbane agreed. Speaking of Humphrey, has anyone confessed to smuggling him into the boat? Well, yes, you actually heard him confess, so Mrs. Brisbane had understood me. Miss Mac glanced over at my cage. Could Humphrey really do that? Miss Brisbane looked my way, too. If there's one thing I've learned this year, when it comes to Humphrey, anything's possible. Boing, boing, Hug twanged, splashing in his tank. The two teachers burst out laughing. When they finished their lunches, they each gave me a treat. From Miss Brisbane, it was a small, crunchy carrot. From Miss Mack, it was a soft, sweet slice of banana. I crossed my paws and hoped they'd have lunch in room 26 more often. Then something really wonderful happened. Miss Mack brought Mr. Fitch to room 26 one day. He said that due to my bravery during the boat race and my contributions to the class, he was presenting me with a very own library card. And there it was, a lovely little rectangle that read, "This card grants full library privileges at Longfellow School to Humphrey." He taped it to the outside of my cage. Everyone applauded. Then Miranda Golden, my special friend, raised her hand. But how is Humphrey going to check out books? He can't get to the library by himself. Oh, humans, there's so much they don't know. In fact, I was already planning to stroll down to the library later that night to see if there was any good movie I could watch. We'll just have to help him out, Mrs. Brisbane answered, just like he always helped us. Hooray for Humphrey! Humphrey Dumpty! AJ suddenly shouted. My friends all joined in, and I even heard Og say, boing, in agreement. Thanks, mateys, I squeaked back happily. Hooray, hooray, hooray. The end. We finished The Adventures According to Humphrey. What a good book. Thank you guys so much for joining along. So now, take out that piece of paper, the information for the 10 Caps game, and fill that out, bring it back to school, bring it to the office, or send it to the office with your teacher, and we will get you all hooked up for 10 Caps tickets, and we'll sit all together for an Aboit night. So I hope to see you there, and have a great rest of your night. Bye, guys.